Play something or starve, the billionaire laughed at her. Those words would haunt Richard Blackstone for the rest of his life, because what happened next in that upscale hotel restaurant didn't just shock everyone present, it completely shattered everything he thought he knew about talent, class, and human dignity. A homeless 19-year-old girl named Emma had just walked into the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, asking for work or just a simple meal. Within minutes, she'd be standing at a concert grand piano, about to deliver a performance that would leave a room full of wealthy patrons speechless. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. This is the true story of how 10 minutes of music exposed a billionaire's cruelty and revealed a genius hiding in plain sight. Here's what really happened. Emma Rivers had been surviving on the streets of New York for 8 months. Every morning she'd wake up in the shelter, pull on the same worn jeans and faded jacket, and head out to find work. Any work that would pay enough for a decent meal. But Emma wasn't always homeless. Just 2 years ago, she'd been a rising star at Juilliard, a child prodigy who'd been playing piano since she was 4. Her parents, both musicians themselves, had sacrificed everything to nurture her talent. Private lessons, competition fees, the best instruments money could buy. Then the accident happened. A drunk driver took both her parents in one terrible night, leaving Emma with nothing but grief and a mountain of medical bills. The insurance money ran out. The apartment went first, then the piano, then everything else that mattered. Now she cleaned offices at night and waited tables when she could find shifts. Her fingers, once nimble enough to tackle the most complex Chopin etudes, now scrubbed floors and carried trays. The calluses had changed, but the muscle memory remained, hidden beneath layers of survival. This particular Tuesday morning, Emma found herself standing outside the Meridian Grand, a 5-star hotel known for its crystal chandeliers and clientele, who paid more for lunch than most people made in a week. The restaurant's ornate windows revealed glimpses of marble floors and, in the far corner, a beautiful Steinway grand piano that seemed to gleam under the ambient lighting. Emma's breath caught when she saw it. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, remembering. She forced herself to look away. Inside that same restaurant, Richard Blackstone was holding court at his usual table. At 55, Richard had built a hotel empire through ruthless business practices and an unwavering belief that people fell into 2 categories, those born to serve and those born to be served. He wore his wealth like armor, the perfectly tailored Armani suit, the Rolex that caught the light when he gestured, the air of absolute authority that made waiters nervously adjust their ties when he walked past. Richard believed deeply that success was always deserved, and failure was always a character flaw. The problem with society today, he was telling his lunch companion, a city councilman, is that we've forgotten the value of earning your place. Everyone expects handouts. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and the gentle clink of expensive silverware against fine china. The Steinway sat silent in its corner, more decoration than instrument. According to the manager, it hadn't been properly played in years, just background music from hired pianists who played safe, forgettable melodies for the dinner crowd. Emma pushed through the revolving door, her heart hammering. She approached the host stand where an impeccably dressed man looked her up and down with barely concealed distaste. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked," he said before she could speak. "I'm not looking for a table," Emma replied quietly. "I was wondering if you needed any help in the kitchen or waiting tables or—" Her voice trailed off as she saw his expression. "Miss, this really isn't the place for you. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the McDonald's down the street." The words hung in the air. Several nearby diners had stopped their conversations, sensing drama. Emma felt her cheeks burn, but she held her ground. "I'm a hard worker. I have experience. What seems to be the problem here?" The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Richard Blackstone had risen from his table and was walking toward them, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The host immediately straightened, recognizing his most valuable customer. Mr. Blackstone, I was just explaining to this young lady that we don't have any positions available. Richard studied Emma with the same expression he might use to examine an interesting but ultimately worthless artifact. His eyes took in her worn clothing, her cheap sneakers, the way she clutched a small backpack against her chest. Interesting, he said slowly. And what exactly were you hoping to do here, young lady? Emma lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Something in his tone made her skin crawl, but desperation overrode pride. Anything honest. I can clean, I can serve, I can wash dishes. I just need work. Richard's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, but his eyes remained cold. Work. He drew the word out, tasting it. Everyone wants to work until they actually have to prove they deserve it. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Other patrons were openly staring now, some pulling out their phones. Emma felt the weight of all those eyes, but something in Richard's tone made her jaw tighten. I'm willing to prove it, she said. Are you? Richard's smile widened. Well then, let me offer you an opportunity. He gestured toward the piano in the corner, and Emma's heart stopped. Entertainment is part of the dining experience here. If you can play something, anything, that's actually worth hearing, I'll make sure you get a meal. Consider it. Earning your keep. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Emma stared at the piano, her mouth going dry. She hadn't played in months, not since she'd been forced to sell her keyboard. Her fingers ached with phantom memory. She began. Unless, of course, you don't actually have any useful skills, Richard continued, his voice carrying just far enough for the gathering crowd to hear. In which case, I think the McDonald's suggestion stands. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, intrigued by the unfolding drama. The host looked mortified, but didn't dare interrupt his most important customer. Emma looked at the piano again. That beautiful Steinway, sitting there like an old friend she'd thought she'd never see again. Her parents' voices echoed in her memory. Music isn't just what you do, Emma. It's who you are. She took a deep breath and looked Richard Blackstone directly in the eyes. I'll play, she said quietly. But when I do, you listen. Something in her voice made Richard's smirk falter for just a moment, but he recovered quickly, gesturing grandly toward the piano. By all means, let's see what you've got. Emma walked toward the Steinway, and with each step, she felt something awakening inside her that had been sleeping far too long. The walk to the piano felt like miles. Emma was acutely aware of every eye in the restaurant following her movement, every whispered comment, every phone being raised to record what was about to happen. Her worn sneakers were silent against the thick carpet surrounding the piano area, but her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Richard Blackstone followed at a leisurely pace, hands clasped behind his back like a professor about to observe a particularly interesting experiment. His voice carried easily across the now quiet restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to have some impromptu entertainment, he announced. This young lady believes she has what it takes to earn her supper. A few people chuckled. Others looked uncomfortable with the spectacle, but nobody left. The host wrung his hands nervously, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Emma reached the piano bench and paused. The Steinway was even more beautiful up close, ebony black with perfect ivory keys that practically glowed in the ambient lighting. She could see her reflection in the polished surface, and for a moment, she barely recognized herself. When had she become so thin? When had her eyes developed those dark circles? She pushed the thoughts away and gently lifted the keyboard cover. The keys were perfectly clean, tuned, waiting. This was a serious instrument, not some restaurant decoration. Someone had been taking care of it, even if nobody played it properly. Well, Richard's voice cut through her reverie. We don't have all day. My lunch is getting cold. More chuckles from the crowd. Emma adjusted the bench height with practiced movements, her muscle memory taking over. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this. The ritual of preparation, the moment of communion between musician and instrument. Richard moved closer, addressing the crowd like a ringmaster. I think we can all agree that everyone should contribute something of value to society. Work for what you receive. It's a lesson many people your age haven't learned. Emma's hands hovered over the keys. She could play something simple, chopsticks or Mary Had a Little Lamb. Take whatever scraps of dignity Richard was willing to offer and walk away with a meal. It would be the smart thing to do. But as her fingers touched the cool ivory, she heard her father's voice. Never apologize for your gifts, Emma. The world needs beautiful things. I'm waiting, Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Perhaps something simple? Chopsticks would be perfect for your skill level. The condescension in his voice hit Emma like a physical blow. She looked up at him. This man in his expensive suit, surrounded by luxury, who thought her life was a moral failing rather than a series of tragedies she'd never chosen. Actually, she said quietly, I was thinking of something a little more challenging. Richard's eyebrows rose. Oh? Such as? Emma's hands found their position on the keyboard. She hadn't played in 8 months, but her fingers remembered. They always remembered. Chopin's Etude Op. 25, number 11, she said. The Winter Wind. The silence that followed was different from before. Anyone with even basic musical knowledge recognized that name. It was one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, a whirlwind of notes that required not just technical skill but deep musical understanding. Richard's smirk wavered. That's quite ambitious. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more accessible? For the first time since entering the restaurant, Emma smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been underestimated one too many times. I'm sure. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Around her, the restaurant held its collective breath. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. A chair creaked. But Emma heard none of it. In her mind, she was 17 again, preparing for her Juilliard audition. Her parents were in the audience, her mother's hands clasped tightly, her father leaning forward with that expression of nervous pride he always wore during her performances. Music is the only honest language, her mother had told her once. It can't lie. It can only reveal truth. Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard Blackstone. This piece, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant, is about surviving storms, about finding beauty in the most difficult moments. Richard's smile had disappeared entirely. Something in Emma's tone, in the way she sat at the piano, in the confidence that had suddenly replaced her earlier desperation, made him shift uncomfortably. Well, he said, his voice lacking its earlier authority, let's see what you can do. Emma placed her hands on the keys. The opening notes of Chopin's Winter Wind required perfect timing, flawless technique, and the kind of musical maturity that usually took decades to develop. She would need to summon every lesson, every hour of practice, every moment of joy she'd ever found at the piano. But first, she would give them silence. One perfect moment of anticipation before everything changed. Emma took one last breath, looked out at the crowd of expectant faces, and began to play. The first notes that emerged from the Steinway weren't the gentle, tentative sounds Richard expected. They were precise, controlled, and filled with a power that immediately commanded attention. Emma's opening was flawless, the delicate melody that would soon explode into Chopin's notorious technical whirlwind. Richard's confident smirk began to crack. He'd expected amateur plinking, maybe a butchered version of a popular song. Instead, he was hearing the opening measures of one of classical music's most demanding pieces, played with a maturity that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. That's actually Chopin, whispered a woman at a nearby table. Her companion, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward with sudden interest. Not just Chopin, he murmured back. That's Opus. 25, number 11. I heard Yuja Wang play this at Carnegie Hall. Emma seemed oblivious to the whispered conversations around her. Her entire being was focused on the keyboard, her fingers moving with increasing complexity as the piece began its inevitable climb toward technical impossibility. Her posture was perfect. Straight back, relaxed shoulders, hands positioned exactly as her conservatory training had drilled into her muscle memory. Richard cleared his throat loudly. Well, that's a nice start, but... The interruption died in his throat as Emma launched into the piece's first major technical passage. Suddenly, the restaurant was filled with cascading notes, each one crystal clear and perfectly placed. This wasn't the playing of an amateur or even a talented hobbyist. This was the work of someone who had dedicated their life to mastering an instrument. The conversations around the room stopped entirely. Waiters paused in their service, trays balanced in midair. Even the kitchen staff had begun emerging from the back, drawn by the sound of music none of them had expected to hear in their workplace. Richard found himself stepping backward, his earlier confidence evaporating with each perfectly executed passage. He tried to maintain his authoritative demeanor, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. The homeless girl he'd intended to humiliate was revealing herself to be something else entirely. She's not just playing the notes, the silver-haired man said in wonder. She's interpreting it. Listen to her phrasing. Indeed, Emma wasn't simply executing a technical exercise. She was telling a story through music, each passage building on the last, creating emotional architecture that had the entire restaurant in its grip. Her eyes were closed now, her body moving slightly with the rhythm, completely lost in the piece she'd once performed for judges who'd given her a standing ovation. Richard tried one more time to regain control of the situation. That's quite enough, he said loudly. Very impressive, but... Shut up. The words came from the silver-haired man, spoken with quiet authority. Don't you dare interrupt this. Richard's mouth fell open. He wasn't accustomed to being spoken to that way, especially not in public. But when he looked around the room, he saw that every face was turned toward Emma, every expression rapt with attention. He had become irrelevant to his own spectacle. Emma's playing intensified, her right hand flying through the piece's notorious technical passages, while her left hand provided the steady, driving rhythm that gave the etude its nickname. The winter wind was meant to evoke a storm, and Emma was summoning one in real time, her fingers moving so quickly they seemed to blur. A young woman near the window pulled out her phone and began recording. Others quickly followed suit. This wasn't just dinner entertainment anymore. They were witnessing something extraordinary, and they knew it. How is she doing that? A teenager asked his mother in an awed whisper. I take piano lessons and I can't even play Für Elise properly. His mother, tears forming in her eyes, just shook her head. She couldn't explain it either. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead. This was supposed to be simple, a brief humiliation of someone who clearly didn't belong in his world, followed by the restoration of proper order. Instead, he was watching his worldview crumble in real time. Because Emma wasn't just playing beautifully, she was playing with the kind of technical mastery and musical understanding that usually took decades to develop. Every note was intentional, every phrase shaped with the confidence of someone who had lived inside this music for years. The restaurant's acoustics, designed to keep conversations private, now worked in Emma's favor. The music filled every corner of the space without overwhelming it, creating an intimate concert hall experience that none of them had expected when they'd sat down for lunch. My God, breathed the restaurant manager, who had emerged from his office to see what was causing the unusual silence in his dining room. We haven't had playing like this since... ever. Richard shot him a withering look, but the manager was too entranced to notice. Emma approached the piece's climactic section, the passage that separated true virtuosos from merely talented players. Her breathing remained steady, her technique flawless as she navigated runs that would have challenged professional concert pianists. Yet there was nothing mechanical about her playing. Each note carried emotional weight. Each phrase told part of the story she was weaving. The winter wind was building to its inevitable storm, and Emma rode it like she'd been born for this moment. Richard realized with growing horror that people were no longer looking at Emma like she was a homeless girl pretending to play piano. They were looking at her like she was exactly what she was revealing herself to be, a trained musician of extraordinary ability who happened to be temporarily down on her luck. "Where did you study?" the silver-haired man called out during a brief pause between movements. Emma didn't answer. Couldn't answer without breaking the musical spell she was weaving. But her playing answered for her. This was conservatory-level technique combined with the musical maturity that only came from years of serious study. Richard's hands were shaking now. The confident businessman who had orchestrated this public humiliation was watching it transform into something else entirely, his own exposure as a man who judged people by their appearance rather than their abilities. The woman who had started recording was now live streaming to her social media, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly. "You guys, I'm at this fancy restaurant and there's this homeless girl playing piano and it's literally the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she whispered into her phone. Within minutes, comments were flooding in from around the world. Musicians, music teachers, and classical music lovers were all trying to identify the piece and the performer. Several recognized the etude immediately and were astounded by the quality of the performance. Emma, oblivious to the digital audience she was gaining, continued to pour her heart into the music. Every frustration of the past 8 months, every moment of loss and grief, every memory of her parents and the life she'd lost, it all flowed through her fingers into the keys. But there was something else in her playing, too. Hope. Resilience. The unbreakable core of who she was, beneath the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. Richard looked around the room desperately, seeking some way to regain control of the narrative, but everywhere he looked, he saw faces transformed by the music. People were crying, others were smiling with pure joy. Some were recording, already composing captions about the incredible performance they were witnessing. And in the center of it all sat Emma, her worn clothes and tired face transformed by the music flowing through her. She looked, in that moment, exactly like what she was, a true artist, sharing her gift with a world that desperately needed beauty. The climax was coming. Richard could feel it building in the music, in the tension of the room, in his own racing heart. Whatever happened next would determine not just Emma's fate, but his own reputation. The winter wind was about to reach its peak, and Richard Blackstone was about to learn what happened when you underestimated the power of genuine talent. Emma's fingers danced across the keys with impossible precision, each note crystalline and perfect. The winter wind was reaching its most demanding passages, and she navigated them like a seasoned professional returning to a favorite piece after a long absence. Her technique was flawless, but more than that, her interpretation was breathtaking. The silver-haired man leaned forward, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I know that phrasing," he whispered to his companion. "That's exactly how Elena Vasquez taught the piece." "I'd recognize her interpretation anywhere." His companion, a music professor from Columbia, nodded in amazement. "Elena only taught at Juilliard. How could this girl possibly—" But Emma's playing answered questions faster than words could ask them. This wasn't someone who had learned Chopin from YouTube videos or community center lessons. This was conservatory training, years of it, executed with the kind of musical maturity that suggested not just talent but deep, scholarly understanding of the composer's intentions. Richard stood frozen, watching his carefully orchestrated humiliation transform into something unrecognizable. The restaurant had become completely silent except for the music, and the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the uncomfortable quiet of witnessing someone's embarrassment. It was the reverent hush of people experiencing something extraordinary. Emma's body moved with the music, her shoulders rising and falling with the emotional peaks and valleys of the piece. Her eyes remained closed, but her expression was completely serene. This was where she belonged, not cleaning offices or scrubbing floors, but creating beauty that could stop time and touch hearts. The teenager who had whispered to his mother earlier was now recording with tears streaming down his face. "Mom, she's incredible," he breathed. "This is better than any concert I've ever been to." A woman at a corner table was frantically typing on her phone. "David, you need to see this," she was texting to someone. "There's a girl playing piano at the Meridian and she's absolutely phenomenal, like Prodigy level phenomenal. The restaurant's acoustics carried every nuance of Emma's performance to every corner of the room. The Steinway responded to her touch like it had been waiting its entire existence for someone who truly understood how to unlock its voice. Each note hung in the air with perfect resonance before blending seamlessly into the next. Richard tried to speak, to somehow reassert control over the situation, but found his voice had deserted him. This wasn't supposed to happen. The homeless girl was supposed to fumble through chopsticks or admit she couldn't play at all, providing a neat moral lesson about people knowing their place. Instead, she was delivering a performance that would have earned a standing ovation at Lincoln Center. The live stream that had started with a few dozen viewers now had thousands watching from around the world. Comments poured in faster than anyone could read them. "Who is this girl? This is Chopin Opus 25 number 11, and it's perfect. Someone find out who she is and get her a recording contract. I'm a piano teacher and this is making me cry." Emma approached the piece's most treacherous passage, a section where the right hand must execute lightning-fast runs while maintaining perfect clarity and expression. Lesser pianists often rushed through it, focusing only on hitting the correct notes. But Emma shaped each phrase like a master sculptor working with sound. The restaurant manager had called over his entire staff to listen. Bus boys, servers, kitchen staff, everyone stood in the periphery, mesmerized. Several of the servers were crying openly, overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty that had invaded their ordinary workday. "In 20 years of managing restaurants," the manager whispered to his assistant manager, "I have never heard anything like this. Never." Richard's throat felt dry. He looked around the room and realized that something fundamental had shifted. People weren't looking at Emma like she was a homeless girl anymore. They were looking at her like she was exactly what she was revealing herself to be, a world-class musician who deserved respect, attention, and admiration. But Emma herself seemed unaware of the transformation happening around her. She was lost in the music, in the joy of reconnecting with the part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. Her fingers moved with the confidence of muscle memory perfected through years of disciplined practice, but her heart poured into every phrase. The piece began its descent toward the final climax, and Emma's playing intensified. The winter wind was reaching its emotional peak, and she rode the musical storm with the skill of someone who had learned to find beauty in chaos. A food critic who had been dining anonymously in the corner was now taking notes frantically. "This isn't just exceptional playing," she scribbled. "This is artistry of the highest order." How is someone of this caliber unknown? But Emma wasn't unknown. Not really. She was just invisible to people who had learned to look past anyone who didn't fit their expectations of what talent looked like. The silver-haired man pulled out his own phone and began making calls. "David, you need to drop everything and get down to the Meridian Grand," he said urgently. "There's a pianist here you need to hear." "No, I'm serious. This is the real deal." David turned out to be David Richardson, artistic director of the New York Philharmonic, and within minutes, he was on his way across town, abandoning his own meeting because Dr. James Hartford, the silver-haired man who had recognized Elena Vasquez's interpretation, had never been wrong about talent. Richard watched the phone calls, the live streams, the tears on the faces around him, and felt something close to panic. This was spiraling completely beyond his control. What had started as a simple demonstration of social hierarchy was becoming something that might define how people saw him for years to come. Emma's left hand maintained the steady, driving rhythm, while her right hand soared through passages that would challenge professional concert pianists. But there was nothing mechanical about her technique. Every note served the music. Every phrase told part of the story she was weaving through sound. The winter wind was building to its inevitable conclusion, and Emma shaped each approaching climax with the patience and skill of a master storyteller. She wasn't just playing notes on a page, she was channeling Chopin's own emotional journey, making it fresh and immediate for everyone in the room. A young conservatory student who had been dining with her parents recognized not just the piece but the level of interpretation. "That's graduate-level playing," she whispered in awe. "Maybe even professional level. How is she not famous?" Her father, a music industry executive, was already thinking the same thing. He'd seen hundreds of talented young musicians over the years, but rarely had he encountered raw ability combined with such mature artistic understanding. This girl, whoever she was, should have been performing at major concert halls, not asking for work in restaurants. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. Every face in the room was turned toward Emma with expressions of wonder, respect, and growing anger at how she was being treated. The moral authority he'd claimed when this started was evaporating with every perfectly executed passage. Emma began the final approach to the piece's climax. The winter wind was reaching its peak intensity, and she navigated the technical demands with a combination of power and delicacy that left everyone breathless. Her hands moved across the keyboard with balletic grace, each movement precise and purposeful. The live stream viewer count had climbed into the tens of thousands. Music lovers from around the world were sharing links, trying to identify the mysterious pianist who was delivering a performance of stunning quality in what appeared to be a restaurant setting. But for Emma, none of the external drama mattered. She was home again, in the place where she'd always belonged. Her parents' voices echoed in her memory. "Music is who you are, Emma. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The final climactic passage approached, and Emma prepared to deliver the conclusion that would either validate everything she'd just played or leave the performance feeling incomplete. But she wasn't worried. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was born to do. The winter wind was about to reach its peak, and everyone in the room, including Richard Blackstone, was about to learn what real talent looked like when it finally found its voice. Emma's fingers struck the final climactic chord of Chopin's Winter Wind with thunderous precision. The last notes resonated through the restaurant's marble halls, lingering in the air like a promise fulfilled. Then, for one perfect moment, there was absolute silence. Complete, total, breathtaking. Silence. No one moved. No one breathed. No one dared break the spell that Emma had woven around them all. Richard Blackstone stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The homeless girl he had intended to humiliate had just delivered a performance that would have earned a standing ovation at Carnegie Hall. Then, like a dam bursting, the silence exploded. Dr. James Hartford was the first to rise, his chair scraping against the floor as he began clapping with slow, deliberate strokes. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding with an intensity that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Brava!" someone shouted from the back of the room. "Incredible!" called another voice. The teenager who had been recording was sobbing openly while he clapped. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life," he choked out between tears. Emma opened her eyes slowly, as if awakening from a beautiful dream. She looked out at the crowd of people on their feet, their faces transformed by what they had just experienced, and for a moment she seemed confused. Then a small, wondering smile spread across her face. But it wasn't triumph in her expression. It was pure joy. The joy of sharing music, of connecting with people through the universal language that her parents had taught her to speak fluently. Richard stood in the middle of the chaos, no longer the center of attention, no longer in control of anything. People pushed past him to get closer to Emma, to thank her, to congratulate her on what they'd just witnessed. "Miss," Dr. Hartford called out, his voice carrying over the applause. "What's your name?" Emma wiped tears from her cheeks. She was crying too now, overwhelmed by the response. "Emma," she said softly. "Emma Rivers." "Emma Rivers," Hartford repeated, as if testing how the name felt. "Where did you study?" "Juilliard," Emma replied, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. I was a student there." A gasp went through the crowd. Juilliard. That explained everything. The technique, the interpretation, the musical maturity that had left them all speechless. Richard finally found his voice. "Now wait just a minute," he began, but his words were drowned out by boos from the crowd. "You should be ashamed of yourself," called out the woman who had been live streaming. "That girl has more talent in her little finger than you have in your entire body." "How dare you treat someone like that?" added another voice. "She asked for work, not charity," said Dr. Hartford, his voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority. "And you turned it into a circus." The food critic who had been taking notes approached Emma, her eyes bright with excitement. "Miss Rivers, I'm Sarah Martinez from the Times. Would you be willing to talk? People need to know who you are." But Emma seemed overwhelmed by the attention. She stood up from the piano bench, swaying slightly, and for a moment it looked like she might faint. The restaurant manager rushed forward. "Miss Rivers, please, sit down. Can I get you some water, some food?" He shot a withering look at Richard. "Anything you want is on the house. I am so sorry for how you were treated." Richard tried one last time to regain control. "Look, I was just trying to give her an opportunity." "To humiliate her," Dr. Hartford interrupted coldly. "That's what you were trying to do. But what you actually did was reveal something extraordinary." Hartford turned to Emma, his expression gentle. "My dear, I'm Dr. James Hartford from the New York Conservatory. I need to ask you, why aren't you performing professionally?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "My parents died 2 years ago. I couldn't afford to continue school. I've been surviving however I could." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the reverent quiet of musical appreciation. This was the heavy silence of people grappling with injustice, with the realization that extraordinary talent could be hiding in plain sight among those society chose to ignore. "Talent doesn't know social class," Emma said quietly, looking directly at Richard for the first time since finishing her performance. The words hung in the air like a musical phrase, simple and profound. Several people in the crowd nodded, some wiping away tears. Richard's face had gone white. The viral video of his behavior was already spreading across social media, accompanied by Emma's breathtaking performance. His name was being attached to one of the most beautiful demonstrations of human dignity anyone had ever witnessed, and he was not coming off well in the comparison. A commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. David Richardson, the artistic director of the New York Philharmonic, had arrived and was pushing through the crowd with several other people Emma didn't recognize but who clearly belonged in the music world. "Where is she?" David asked urgently. "Where's the pianist?" Dr. Hartford smiled and gestured toward Emma. "David, meet Emma Rivers. Emma, this is David Richardson, no relation, from the Philharmonic." David studied Emma with the intense gaze of someone who had spent his life evaluating musical talent. "Miss Rivers, I heard the last few minutes through Dr. Hartford's phone. Would you be willing to play something else?" Emma looked around the room, still overwhelmed by the attention, the applause, the complete reversal of everything that had happened in the past hour. She began, then stopped. She looked at the piano, then at the faces surrounding her, faces full of respect, admiration, and hope. "Everyone has a song inside them," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I just want to share mine." The crowd erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just appreciation for a beautiful performance. It was recognition of a beautiful human being who had maintained her dignity and grace despite everything life had thrown at her. Richard Blackstone stood at the edge of the crowd, forgotten and irrelevant, watching his intended victim become the hero of a story that would be told and retold for years to come. The piano waited, and Emma was finally ready to claim her place in the world again. The aftermath unfolded like a fairy tale, but one grounded in the very real consequences of viral fame and genuine talent finally recognized. Within an hour, Emma's performance had been viewed over 1 million times across multiple social media platforms. The hashtag Emma Rivers was trending worldwide, with musicians, music lovers, and social justice advocates sharing the video and demanding to know more about the extraordinary young woman who had turned a moment of intended humiliation into a triumph of human dignity. Richard Blackstone sat alone at his table, his expensive lunch untouched and cold. His usual dining companions had quietly excused themselves, unwilling to be associated with what everyone was calling the most tone-deaf display of privilege in recent memory. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from his PR team, board members, and journalists seeking comment. The restaurant manager, James Morrison, had quietly asked Richard to settle his bill and leave. "Mr. Blackstone," he'd said with professional courtesy, barely masking his disgust, "I think it would be best if you took some time away from the Meridian. Your membership will be under review." Meanwhile, Emma found herself surrounded by a growing circle of opportunity. David Richardson from the Philharmonic had offered her a spot as a featured soloist in their upcoming season. Dr. Hartford was arranging for her to complete her degree at the New York Conservatory with a full scholarship. 3 different record labels had called the restaurant asking to be put in touch with her. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah Martinez from The Times was documenting everything, ensuring that Emma's story would be told properly, not as a feel-good charity case, but as a recognition of excellence that had been hiding in plain sight. "The system failed her," Martinez told her editor over the phone while watching Emma graciously thank each person who approached her. "But her talent didn't fail us. She's been performing at this level all along. We just weren't paying attention." The woman who had live-streamed the performance was still broadcasting, now interviewing other diners about what they'd witnessed. "I've been to Lincoln Center dozens of times," one patron told her camera, "and I've never heard anything that moved me like that. She didn't just play music, she created something transcendent." Emma, still overwhelmed but growing more composed by the minute, found herself in an impromptu receiving line of people wanting to shake her hand, thank her, or simply tell her how her music had affected them. "You reminded me why I became a musician in the first place," a young conservatory student told her, tears in her eyes. An elderly man who identified himself as a retired music teacher pressed a business card into her hand. "My grandson runs a small record label," he said. "When you're ready, call him. The world needs to hear more of your music." Through it all, Emma maintained the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the ordeal. She thanked everyone genuinely, accepted offers thoughtfully, and deflected attempts to turn Richard into a villain. "He made assumptions," she told Sarah Martinez when asked about Richard's behavior. "We all make assumptions sometimes." I hope today reminds us all to look deeper. As the crowd gradually began to disperse, people returning to their lives but carrying Emma's music with them, the restaurant slowly returned to normal operation. But the Steinway in the corner would never be just decoration again. James Morrison had already arranged for a small plaque to be installed. "This piano was played by Emma Rivers, February 15th, 2024. A reminder that extraordinary things can happen when we make space for unexpected beauty. Richard Blackstone's attempts to teach a lesson about earning your place had backfired spectacularly. Instead, Emma had taught everyone present a more important lesson about recognizing worth beyond appearances. The videos would continue spreading, the offers would keep coming, and Emma's life was about to change forever. 6 months later, Emma Rivers walked onto the stage at Lincoln Center wearing an elegant black concert gown, her hair pulled back in the classic style of a professional pianist. The sold-out audience rose to their feet before she'd played a single note. Many of them had discovered her through that viral video, and they'd been waiting for this moment ever since. In the front row sat Dr. Hartford and David Richardson, beaming with pride at their protege. Sarah Martinez was there too, working on a follow-up story about Emma's meteoric rise in the classical music world. Emma had recorded her debut album, Hidden Voices, which had debuted at #1 on the classical charts. She'd completed her degree at the New York Conservatory with highest honors. Most importantly, she'd established the Emma Rivers Foundation, providing music education and instruments to underprivileged young musicians. As she sat at the concert grand piano, a Steinway, naturally, Emma thought briefly about that day at the Meridian Grand. The memory no longer caused her pain. Instead, it reminded her that sometimes our worst moments can become doorways to our best futures. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Winter Wind filled the hall, but this time everyone was listening from the very beginning. As for Richard Blackstone, he was learning humility the hard way, one public relations disaster at a time. But that's another story entirely. The music soared, and Emma was finally completely home.
What happened today isn't just a story. It's a reminder. Silence protects systems, but courage rewrites them. At Beat Stories, we don't just watch change, we document it. Subscribe for more real stories that challenge power and amplify truth.